Hello, this is section 1.1. We're going to be talking about mathematics and problem solving. So, just to kind of get you introduced into the topic, we're going to start off by just talking about some approaches to problem solving and some things that you can do that will help you in the process. There are many different ways to approach a problem, but the most important thing to remember is always to read the problem completely before you begin and take a minute to think about what you're doing before you start. Not everything has to be done with a formula or algebraically. Thinking your way through a problem is a wonderful strategy. And I would venture to say that this is where I see students have the most trouble, especially with word problems. Because they read through the word problem and they just want to immediately start writing stuff down. This is not the way to approach problems, especially in mathematics or in anything in life, really. You've got to stop for a minute, think about what it is that you just read, try and figure out what they're asking, and then kind of devise a plan to figure out how to go about answering it. That's probably the most crucial step in the entire process. And in fact, there was a mathematician, a Hungarian mathematician named George Polya. He taught at Stanford, and in 1945, he published a book called How to Solve It, which really has become the standard for problem solving. Now, in his book, he outlines 4 steps to problem solving, and they are absolutely fantastic. And I would even venture to say that the first two here are probably the keys to being able to be a good problem solver. The first step is preparation, understanding the problem. This is where you read through the problem and try and figure out what are they telling us, what are they asking us to do, and then trying to kind of wrap your head around all of that information. This is the time that you take before you ever pick up a pencil and start trying to figure anything out. Step 2 is your thinking time, which is where you start devising a plan. This is where you start looking through your toolbox, so to speak, and trying to figure out, okay, so I know that they've given me this information, and I know that they want me to find this information. So how can I try and get from point A to point B? That's your time that you're thinking about the problem. Now, step 3, he calls insight or carrying out the plan. And this is where you would actually go through and do the mathematics or, write out something. Sometimes you'll be drawing pictures or in this lesson, we're actually going to be drawing some things out and trying to figure out what's going on, just using problem solving techniques instead of full on mathematics. But this would be the step that you would take to go ahead and work through the problem. And then the last step is verification. And this is something that we forget to do from time to time. This is where we reread the problem after we've already answered it, but we reread the problem to make sure that your answer makes sense. If they tell you, let's say something like, Johnny made, you know, um, $5 an hour starting out, and 2 years later he made $7 an hour, and you're supposed to find out how much his raise was. Well, if you work through the problem and you end up getting an answer of like $9, then that doesn't make logical sense. So you would want to go back and reread the problem and make sure that your answer is logical as an answer for the problem. So then that way you can kind of fix and correct some of your mistakes as you go through. Now, using these techniques, we can solve just about anything that comes our way. But there are some strategies that go along with that. And some of these I use constantly, and sometimes several of them within a problem. So, always a good thing to do is to look for a pattern. Especially if you're given a series of numbers or something like there are a series of objects, sometimes there's a pattern in that you want to try to identify and move forward with. Another good strategy is to examine a related problem or even a similar problem, a simpler problem, and maybe even make a table. I always say whenever we're working word problems, I like to have students sometimes just plug some numbers in to see what they're talking about and help them to understand the problem a little bit better. Um, the fourth strategy is to identify a sub goal. Sometimes you need information before you can actually solve a problem. So, like for instance, when you were in beginning algebra, you were writing equations of lines. But before you could write the equation of a line, sometimes you had to find the slope so that you could use that in your equation of a line. So that would be a case of identifying a sub-goal. Also, you could make a diagram or a picture. There are lots of times that you'll be working with problems, and it's easy to draw out a quick rectangle or a triangle and label the sides or something like that, and so that you can get that nice visual on what's going on. Another strategy that absolutely works sometimes is guess and check. And, sometimes whenever you don't know what to do, that is the best thing to do, just to kind of, say, well, what's possible? This sounds reasonable to me. Let me plug it in and see if it works. And if it doesn't, you can try something else. And then lastly, we have write an equation. And, obviously we're going to be writing equations and solving them in order to be able to figure out our answers. But that's not always the first thing you do. It's much, much more important for you to read through the problem and think your way through it before you ever start trying to work through to answer the question. So I want you to keep that in mind, especially as we're working through some of these examples. All right, so we're ready to tackle them. So in the next video, we'll start doing examples.